The phone buzzed on my nightstand at 11:47 p.m. I almost didn't look at it. I'd just finished a double shift at the hospital, 12 hours on my feet in the cardiac unit, and my body felt like it had been wrung out and left to dry. But something made me reach for it. Maybe instinct. Maybe the same instinct that had kept me alive through nursing school, through my divorce, through every moment my family had decided I was the one they could afford to break. The text was from my mother. "Your brother's at your door. Don't let him in. He made his bed." I stared at the screen for 3 full seconds. Then I heard the knocking. It wasn't loud. That was the thing that got me out of bed faster than anything else would have. If it had been loud, frantic, demanding, I might have assumed it was a neighbor, a wrong address, someone else's emergency. But this knocking was quiet. 3 soft taps. The kind a person makes when they're not sure they deserve to be heard. I pulled on the hoodie hanging off my desk chair and walked to the front door of my apartment. I checked the peephole first, a habit I'd built after my ex-husband spent 2 months showing up uninvited and calling it love. The porch light was on. I could see a figure leaning against the door frame, one shoulder pressed against the wood like it was the only thing holding him upright. It was my brother. His name is Daniel. He's 31, 2 years older than me, and the last time I'd seen him in person was Thanksgiving, when he'd sat across the dinner table and stared at his plate while our stepfather said things that no one challenged, because no one ever challenged Richard in that house. I opened the door. Daniel looked up at me. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. There was dried blood under his nose, a split along his lower lip, and the way he was holding his right arm told me immediately, before he said a single word, that something was wrong with his ribs. "Hey," he said. "Get inside," I said. He didn't argue. He stepped through the door carefully, the way people move when they're trying not to find out how bad the pain actually is. I closed and locked the door behind him, turned on the kitchen light, and started pulling what I needed from the cabinet above the refrigerator. Gloves, gauze, the small medical kit I kept stocked out of professional habit. "Sit," I said, pointing to the kitchen chair. He sat. I worked quietly for a few minutes, cleaning the cut on his lip, checking his pupil response, pressing carefully along his rib cage to map the damage. He winced hard at the 4th rib on his right side, but didn't make a sound. He'd always been like that. Quiet through pain. I used to think it was strength. I understood now that it was something else entirely. It was what happened when you learned, very young, that making noise only made things worse. "Who did this?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the kitchen table, at the grain of the wood, at nothing. "Daniel." "Marcus," he said. "Marcus. My brother's business partner. The man he had co-signed a lease with, shared a bank account with for their landscaping company, trusted with 3 years of everything he'd built from the ground up. Marcus, who I had met exactly twice, and both times walked away feeling like I needed to wash my hands. "He came to the shop," Daniel said. His voice was flat, not emotionless. Flat the way a voice gets when the emotion is too large to fit through a normal channel. "He'd been taking money from the business account. I found out last week. I confronted him today." "How much?" Daniel looked at me. $43,000. The number sat between us in the kitchen light. He said if I went to the police, he'd tell them it was mutual. That I knew, that I signed off on everything. Daniel touched the edge of the table with his fingertip. "He has emails he doctored," he said. "He said no one would believe me over him." I pulled off my gloves and set them on the counter. "And then he hit you. And then he hit me." I looked at my brother's face, the swollen eye, the split lip, the careful way he was breathing. I thought about the text on my phone. "Don't let him in. He made his bed." My mother, who had known, who had already heard from someone, maybe Marcus himself, maybe Richard, and had made her decision before Daniel ever knocked on my door. I thought about the 3 years Daniel had spent building that company. Early mornings, late nights, calluses on his hands, weekends he skipped because there was always one more job to finish. He borrowed $8,000 from her mother to buy his first truck, paid her back in 4 months, and she'd taken the credit for his success at every family dinner since. And now she was telling me not to open the door. I picked up my phone and read the text again. I set it face down on the counter. "Okay," I said, "here's what's going to happen tonight. You're going to sleep on my couch. In the morning, I'm going to drive you somewhere, and you're going to tell me everything. Everything you remember, in order, starting from the first time something felt wrong." Daniel looked at me like I'd said something in a language he didn't quite speak yet. "Why?" he asked. "Because I'm a nurse," I said, "and because I've spent 3 years working in a hospital watching people make decisions in a crisis. And the people who survive are the ones who document everything and don't act until they understand exactly what they're dealing with." I turned off the kitchen light and went to the closet for a pillow and blanket. "Also," I said, "because you're my brother, and somebody has to be. I want to explain something about my job before I explain what came next. I work in the cardiac unit at St. Alden's Regional Medical Center. I have been a registered nurse for 6 years. In that time, I have learned more about human anatomy than I ever expected, but I have also learned something that nursing school doesn't teach directly, and that you only understand after enough hours at a bedside. The medical system runs on paper. Everything that happens, every medication administered, every symptom reported, every conversation with a physician, becomes a record, and records are the difference between what happened and what can be proven. When I was 24, my ex-husband, a man named Travis, who I married too young and left too late, put his hand around my throat during an argument and told me if I ever called the police he would lose his job and that would be my fault. I didn't call the police that night. What I did do the next morning was walk into the urgent care clinic near our apartment and ask them to document the bruising. The nurse practitioner who saw me looked at my neck, looked at my face, and asked me one question. "Do you want this on record?" I said yes. 3 years later, that record was part of why the divorce judge looked at Travis's attorney and denied his request for shared custody of the dog, the only thing either of us had been fighting over by that point. A small thing, but a thing that was mine because I had understood, even at 24. That paper outlasts memory. I thought about that the next morning as I drove Daniel to a walk-in clinic 7 miles from his apartment. Not the one closest to him, and not the hospital where I worked. I needed a neutral record, somewhere with no connection to me professionally, somewhere that would simply document what it observed. The physician assistant who examined him noted 2 bruised ribs, contusions around the left orbital socket, and lacerations consistent with blunt force impact. She asked Daniel what happened. He told her he'd been assaulted by his business partner. She wrote it down. When we left, I had him take a photo of the documentation summary on his phone and text it to my email. "What are we doing?" he asked, standing in the parking lot in the mid-morning sun. "Building a case," I said. "Get in the car, tell me about the bank account." What Daniel told me over the next 2 hours, parked outside a coffee shop with the engine running and the heat on, was a story I recognized in structure even if I hadn't lived it myself. It was the story of someone being slowly shifted off the foundation of something they built until they were standing on nothing and didn't know when the ground had moved. He and Marcus had started the company 3 years ago with equal investment. Daniel did the physical work, the actual landscaping, the equipment maintenance, the client relationships. Marcus handled the administrative side, invoicing, payroll, the business bank account. This had seemed like a reasonable division of labor between 2 friends, 2 people who trusted each other. What Daniel had not understood, and what I understood immediately, because I had spent years watching hospital administrators make the same distinction, was that the person who controls the records controls the records controls the records. Marcus had been skimming from the business account for at least 18 months. Small amounts at first, vendor payments to companies that didn't exist, reimbursements for equipment that was never purchased, then larger amounts, transfers to a personal account that Daniel hadn't known existed. By the time Daniel noticed the discrepancy, because a supplier called him about an unpaid invoice and Daniel looked at the account and saw the balance was $4,200 when it should have been over $40,000, Marcus had covered his tracks with paperwork, altered invoices, a second set of records that made the withdrawals look authorized, and at least 3 emails in Daniel's name sent from a shared business account that appeared to approve the transfers. He had access to the shared email, Daniel said, We both did. For client stuff. Can you access that email now? He changed the password 2 days ago. I nodded. This was not a coincidence. Marcus had seen Daniel coming. He'd had time to prepare. What about your personal email? Any business conversations there? Daniel thought. Some. Clients contacted me on my personal email sometimes. And there were a few times Marcus and I argued over text about how money was being handled. I complained about the balance being lower than I expected. He told me it was normal, seasonal fluctuations. Forward all of those texts to me right now, I said. Screenshots, not copies. Screenshots show the date and the contact name. While he did that, I was already on my phone, looking up something I'd been thinking about since the night before. Texas has a law called the Theft of Service Statute, and it overlaps with civil fraud in ways that become very important when the theft occurs within a business partnership. $43,000 put this squarely in felony territory. But the doctored emails were the part that made my jaw tighten, because that crossed into something else: identity fraud. Using someone's name and credentials to authorize transactions they never approved. I was a nurse, not a lawyer. But I had spent 6 years working beside people who were meticulous about evidence because lives depended on it, and I knew one thing clearly. We needed an attorney before we needed anything else, and we needed one who handled business fraud, not just general practice. I also knew something else, something I hadn't told Daniel yet, because I was still deciding how to say it. I had called my mother that morning, while Daniel was in the shower. She'd answered on the second ring. And before I could speak, she said, "I told you not to let him in." He had 2 bruised ribs, I said. He got himself into this. Did you know about Marcus? I asked, before last night? There was a pause, long enough that I had my answer before she spoke. Richard knows Marcus's family, she said. They go to the same church. This is a business dispute. It has nothing to do with us, and if you get involved, you're going to make things very difficult for your stepfather. I held the phone and let the silence stretch. He's your son, I said. He made choices, she said. I hung up. I want to be precise about what my mother did and did not do, because I think precision matters when you're angry, and it's easy to make things larger or smaller than they are. She did not hit Daniel. She did not steal from him. She was not Marcus and she was not Richard, and the things she did were quieter and therefore easier for her to live with. What she did was this. She found out that the man her husband's church friend's son had robbed her son of $43,000 and beaten him badly enough to bruise his ribs. And she decided that the social cost to herself was more important than the physical safety of her child. She called me to warn me away from involvement. She did not call Daniel to check if he was alive. I have thought about this many times since. I have tried to understand it the way I try to understand difficult things, not to excuse but to see clearly. What I came to was this. My mother had married Richard when I was 12 and Daniel was 14, and in the years since, she had bent herself so completely around his preferences and his social relationships that she had lost the ability to locate her own priorities underneath them. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had made herself smaller and smaller until the space she occupied had no room for her children's emergencies. That understanding did not change what I did next. It only made me do it more quietly. The attorney's name was Patricia Okonkwo. She was 48 years old, had been practicing business litigation in Houston for 19 years, and came recommended by a physician at my hospital who had used her 3 years ago when a former partner tried to steal her medical practice out from under her. I called her office at noon, explained the situation in 6 sentences, and had an appointment for the following morning. In the meantime, Daniel and I did the work. We went through every text message between him and Marcus going back 2 years. We went through every email Daniel had on his personal account that touched the business. We went through bank statements Daniel had access to. He was on the account. He could still pull the history even though the balance was gutted. And I built a timeline on a legal pad, date by column, with amounts in one column and what the records claimed they were for in another. By 8 o'clock that evening, the pattern was clear enough that I didn't need to be an attorney to see it. The false vendor payments had started in March of the previous year, small enough to disappear into normal operating expenses. They increased after August, when the company had its best quarter and the account balance was high enough that large withdrawals were easier to disguise. The emails sent in Daniel's name, approving transfers, authorizing payments, all occurred on weekdays between 9 and 11 a.m., when Marcus knew Daniel was in the field and not at a desk. He had planned this. Not impulsively, not in anger. He had planned it across 18 months. "He was my friend," Daniel said. "He wasn't saying it to me, he was saying it to the kitchen table." "I know," I said. "We played basketball together in high school. I was in his wedding." "I know." He looked up at me. "How do you do this? How do you look at someone and not know?" I thought about Travis, about the years I had spent looking at a face I thought I knew and finding out, slowly and then all at once, that people can build an entire architecture of false things and maintain it effortlessly as long as no one looks too closely. "You don't always," I said. "Sometimes you don't find out until you look at the records." Patricia Okonkwo had a corner office with 2 windows and a credenza lined with legal binders. She sat across from us the next morning and read through everything we'd printed without speaking for 11 minutes. I timed it. When she set the papers down, she looked at Daniel first and then at me. "You did good work," she said. "Both of you." Daniel exhaled beside me. "The altered invoices are significant," she said, "because they establish intent. This wasn't a misunderstanding about shared funds. Someone deliberately created false documentation. The emails sent from the shared account in your name," she looked at Daniel, "are where this crosses from theft into identity fraud under Texas law. That's a separate charge." "What does that mean for him?" Daniel asked. "It means he's looking at felony theft. 43,000 puts this at a second-degree felony, plus identity fraud, which carries its own penalties. Civilly, we can pursue full recovery of the stolen funds plus damages." She set her pen down. "What it also means is that the story he planned to tell, that you both signed off, that it was mutual, falls apart when we show the email timestamps against his phone's location data, which we can subpoena, and against the records showing you were running jobs in the field during every single one of those authorizations." She looked at me. "You're the one who built the timeline?" "Yes," I said. "You do this for a living?" "I'm a nurse." She almost smiled. "Same skill set, different context. I should tell you what happened with my mother because I think people sometimes want a story to be only about the villain who stole something and the hero who took it back, and that's a clean story. It's satisfying. But it's not usually the whole truth. My mother called me 4 days after Daniel and I met with Patricia. She had heard from Richard, who had heard from someone at the church, that Daniel was pursuing legal action against Marcus. "You need to stop this," she said. "I'm not the one who needs to stop anything," I said. "I'm not party to the lawsuit. You put him up to it." He came to my door with 2 bruised ribs. I helped him document what happened to him. That's what I do. That's my job. You are going to humiliate this family in front of people we have known for 20 years. I sat with that for a moment. The word humiliate, not hurt, not harm. The thing she was protecting was not a person, it was a reputation, a seat at a church table, a set of relationships that had never once protected her children. "Mom," I said, "when Daniel knocked on my door, you texted me to leave him outside." She didn't answer. "You knew he was hurt. You knew what Marcus had done. And the thing you were most worried about was what it would cost Richard socially." I kept my voice even, I was not yelling. I have never been a person who yells, because I grew up in a house where yelling was how the most dangerous person in the room maintained control, and I made a decision young to find other tools. "I'm not angry at you. I want you to understand that. I'm not angry. I'm just very clear now about something I've been uncertain about my whole life." "What's that?" "Whether this family was a safe place for me and Daniel to need something." She hung up. She didn't call back for 3 weeks. When she did, it was to tell me that Richard was upset, that this was dividing the family, and that she hoped I was proud of myself. I told her I was actually, and I meant it. Marcus hired an attorney, which Patricia had expected. His defense was exactly what he'd promised it would be. Shared authorization, mutual decision-making, Daniel's implicit approval of all financial decisions as a co-owner of the business. It collapsed in 11 days. Patricia's team subpoenaed Marcus's phone records, which placed him at his apartment, not the business, during every single email sent from the shared account that authorized the fraudulent transfers. She also subpoenaed the bank records for the personal account the money had been transferred to, which Marcus had opened 8 months into the scheme and never disclosed to Daniel. The altered invoices, when compared against the actual vendors who had no record of the transactions and provided signed statements to that effect, established deliberate falsification. But the thing that ended it, the moment that I still think about when I want to remember what careful, patient work can do, was something Daniel found himself. 2 weeks before Marcus had assaulted him, Daniel had texted Marcus about a vendor invoice that didn't look right. He'd been vague in the text, not knowing yet what he was looking at, but Marcus had responded. And in his response, trying to wave Daniel off, Marcus had written, "Don't stress it. I moved some stuff around. I'll explain later. Trust me." I moved some stuff around. I'll explain later. Trust me. I moved some stuff around. 8 words, sent on a Thursday afternoon. Patricia brought them into the courtroom and let them sit. The case settled before it went to full trial. Marcus agreed to full restitution, all $43,000, plus the legal fees Daniel had incurred, plus an additional sum that covered the wages Daniel had lost while the business was functionally paralyzed during the dispute. Marcus pled guilty to felony theft. The identity fraud charge was included in the plea. He received 5 years of probation, was ordered to complete financial fraud counseling, and was prohibited from holding a signatory role on any business account for 10 years. Daniel was in the courthouse hallway when we got the terms. He sat down on a bench and put his face in his hands. I sat next to him and didn't say anything for a while. "It doesn't feel like I thought it would," he said. "It never does," I said. "It feels like being tired. And then after the tired, it feels like being able to breathe." He looked at me sideways. "Is that from a medical textbook?" "It's from being 31 and having been through a thing or two." He almost laughed. It was the first time I'd seen something close to a real expression on his face since he'd knocked on my door. The landscaping company's running now. Daniel hired a bookkeeper, an actual professional, someone whose entire job is to track where the money goes, and rebuilt the client list from the contracts that had survived the disruption. He paid back the equipment loans that had gone unpaid during the legal process. By the following spring, he had 3 full-time employees and a waiting list. He called me on a Tuesday evening in April to tell me he'd just signed his largest commercial contract to date, a property management company with 16 sites across the greater Houston area. "I wanted you to know first," he said. "I'm glad you called," I said. There was a pause. "I've been thinking," he said, "about that night, when I knocked on your door." "Yeah, I almost didn't. I sat in my car outside your building for 20 minutes. I thought, I don't know. I thought maybe Mom was right that I'd made my own mess, that I shouldn't drag you into it." I looked out my apartment window. The streetlight was on. It was late. "Daniel," I said, "you knocked on the right door." He was quiet for a moment. "Why did you open it?" he asked. "Knowing what it was going to cost, knowing Mom was already texting you." I thought about that. I thought about being 12 years old and learning that the people in your house could decide on any given day that your needs were inconvenient. I thought about the way you spend years after that testing every door, every relationship, every offer of safety, bracing yourself for the moment they change their mind. "Because someone opened a door for me once," I said, "when I needed it, and I decided a long time ago that I was going to be that person for someone else." "Who opened it for you?" I smiled. "A nurse practitioner in an urgent care clinic. She asked me one question and wrote down my answer, and that paper was there 3 years later when I needed it." He didn't say anything for a while. "That's a really specific story," he said. "Most good things are. My mother and I are not estranged. I want to be clear about that. We talk, not as often as we used to, and differently than we used to. She has not apologized. I don't think she believes she has something to apologize for, and I've made my peace with the fact that some people can only protect themselves by rewriting events until the original shape is gone. What I know is this. Daniel was outside my door at 11:47 p.m., with 2 bruised ribs and nowhere else to go. And I know what the right answer was, even when the text on my phone was telling me otherwise. Some decisions don't feel hard in the moment because you've already made them. You made them years ago, quietly, in response to something that happened to you. And when the moment comes, you're not deciding. You're just doing what you already became. I opened the door. That's who I am. The rest is paperwork. There's something nobody tells you about doing the right thing. It rarely feels heroic in the moment. It feels like exhaustion. It feels like a phone buzzing at 11:47 p.m. when your body is already running on empty. It feels like standing in a kitchen under fluorescent light, pulling on latex gloves and pressing carefully along someone's ribcage to find the damage. When Daniel knocked on my door that night, I didn't make a brave choice. I made the only choice I knew how to make, the one I had trained myself toward across years of small, quiet decisions that nobody saw. That's the thing about character. It doesn't appear fully formed in a single dramatic moment. It gets built, slowly, out of what you choose to pay attention to and what you choose to learn and what you refuse to let yourself forget. Daniel lost $43,000 because he trusted the wrong person. But the reason Marcus was able to take that much for that long was that Daniel had stopped paying attention to the records. Not out of laziness. Out of loyalty. He trusted Marcus the way you trust someone you've known since high school, the way you trust the people who were in your wedding, and that trust became the gap that someone with bad intentions walked straight through. The first thing I understood when he told me the story was that the money wasn't the real wound. The real wound was the realization that the structure he'd built his livelihood on had a false floor the entire time. What closes that gap, what fills that false floor in, is not suspicion. It's not cynicism. It's the simple, unglamorous habit of keeping records, of asking where things are, of not letting comfort become an excuse for not looking. I learned that as a nurse. Every medication I administer, every symptom I document, every conversation I write into a chart is a small act of rigor that protects someone who cannot protect themselves in that moment. Marcus had counted on Daniel never looking too closely. He was wrong eventually. But the cost of that eventual look was steep. My mother made a different kind of choice that night. She chose the version of reality that was easier to live in, the one where Daniel's trouble was his own fault, where staying out of it was neutral, where protecting Richard's social standing was not the same thing as abandoning her son. I don't think she is a bad person. I think she is a person who stopped developing the capacity for hard choices a long time ago and has been living inside that limitation ever since. That's the quieter kind of cost, not the money Marcus stole, but the slow erosion of what you're capable of when you spend years avoiding difficulty. What I want anyone watching this to take away is not a lesson about business partnerships or legal statutes or how to build a fraud case. What I want you to take away is simpler than that. The people who came through hardest in this story were the ones who stayed rigorous, who documented, who questioned, who refused to let sentiment override their responsibility to see clearly. And the ones who caused the most damage were the ones who had stopped doing that work entirely. Marcus, who let greed override every standard he'd once held. My mother, who let comfort override love. You don't get to coast through your life and also be the person someone can count on at midnight. Those two things are not compatible. The door I opened for Daniel was built over years of small disciplines, small acts of attention, small choices to stay honest about what I was seeing even when it was inconvenient. If you want to be someone's open door, and I believe most people do, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, that's where it starts, not in a single heroic moment, in every ordinary day before it.